When my daughter, Sophia, announced to 40 guests at her birthday party that Mom's broke anyway, she had no idea that 72 hours later, I'd be signing documents that would either secure her future or strip it away entirely. What she didn't know was that the struggling single mother she was mocking had been quietly building an empire that would soon be worth more than everything her wealthy in-laws owned combined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the moment my world turned upside down, because what happened next would change both our lives forever. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and at 70 years old, I've learned that the biggest mistakes we make are the assumptions we hold about the people closest to us. I spent 42 years working as a night shift custodian at Riverside General Hospital in the small town of Millbrook, Maine. Most people saw me as just another invisible worker, someone who cleaned up after others and went home to a modest life. After my husband Charles died 15 years ago, I raised our daughter Sophia alone. She was 23 then, fresh out of college with big dreams and an even bigger sense of entitlement. I watched her transform from the sweet girl who used to help me sort recyclables for extra grocery money into someone who measured her worth by the price tags on her clothes. Sophia married into the Ashford family 3 years after her father's death. The Ashfords owned the largest construction company in 3 counties, lived in a mansion overlooking Pemaquid Bay, and had the kind of old money that whispered instead of shouted. From the moment Sophia said "I do" to their son Benjamin, she seemed to forget where she came from. Our house on Pine Street was a simple 2-story colonial that Charles and I had bought when we were newlyweds. The mortgage was paid off years ago, and I'd maintained it meticulously, but compared to the Ashford estate, it might as well have been a shack. When Sophia visited, which became increasingly rare, I could see her cataloging every outdated fixture, every piece of furniture that had seen better decades. What Sophia didn't know, what I'd deliberately hidden from her, was that my custodial job had given me access to information that most people never see. Hospital administrators, county officials, and business owners all passed through those halls late at night, and they talked freely around the invisible cleaning lady. Over the years, I'd overheard merger discussions, zoning debates, and development plans that weren't public knowledge. More importantly, I'd learned to listen. It started innocently enough. In 1998, I overheard Dr. Marcus Holloway, the hospital's chief administrator, talking to the county assessor about a proposed medical complex. They needed land, lots of it, and they were looking at the rural area just outside town where property was still cheap. I went home that night and looked at maps, studied property records at the courthouse during my lunch breaks, and slowly began to understand something that would change my life. Millbrook was going to grow. Not quickly, not obviously, but inevitably. I started small. There was a farmer named Roy Winters who owned 20 acres on Route 32, land that he'd been talking about selling since his arthritis made it impossible to work. The property was just scrub and old pasture, but I'd learned from my hospital conversations that it sat directly in the path of the proposed medical complex expansion. Using my savings, money I'd scraped together from working double shifts and living on beans and rice, I approached Roy with an offer. $15,000 for 20 acres that the county records showed was worth maybe $8,000. Roy thought I was crazy, but he wasn't about to argue with cash. That was my first purchase. Over the next 15 years, I would buy 17 more parcels, always through intermediaries, always paying cash, always staying invisible. The local real estate agents started calling me the ghost buyer because they never knew who was behind the purchases. My strategy was simple. Attend every town meeting, read every planning document, and listen to every conversation that happened near my mop bucket. When the hospital board discussed expanding the emergency department, I bought land near the proposed site. When the state talked about widening Route 32, I purchased properties along the corridor. When Walmart started sniffing around for a new location, I quietly acquired the perfect spot before they even announced their interest. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Sophia was learning to navigate cocktail parties and charity galas, her mother was becoming one of the largest landowners in Cumberland County.
Benjamin Ashford met me at the door with his usual practiced smile. He was polite enough, but I could see him calculating the cost of my department store dress, probably wondering why his wife couldn't convince her mother to upgrade her wardrobe. "Eleanor," he said, "how wonderful that you could make it." The party was elegant in that effortless way that comes from hiring professionals and having more money than taste. Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres I couldn't pronounce. The living room, with its 14-foot ceilings and crystal chandeliers, was filled with people who spoke in the coded language of the privileged, discussing their little place in Bar Harbor or their children's acceptances to Ivy League schools. I found myself standing near the mahogany bar, nursing a single glass of wine, and watching my daughter work the room. Sophia looked stunning in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She moved with confidence, air-kissing friends and laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny. For a moment, I felt proud of how far she'd come, even if the journey had taken her away from me. The gift opening happened in the library, a room lined with leather-bound books that looked like they'd never been opened. Sophia sat in a wing-back chair that probably belonged in a museum, surrounded by presents wrapped in paper that was too beautiful to tear. There were jewelry boxes from Tiffany, gift certificates to spas I'd never heard of, and a set of crystal wine glasses that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. When she got to my gift, a small wrapped box containing a simple gold necklace I'd saved for 3 months to buy, the room went quiet. Sophia opened it carefully, and I watched her face as she recognized what it was. The necklace had belonged to her grandmother, my mother, who'd passed it down to me with instructions to give it to my daughter when she was old enough to appreciate its value. Not monetary value, it was probably worth $200 at most, but the value of family history, of connection across generations. "Oh," Sophia said, holding it up to the light, "it's quaint." There was polite laughter from the assembled guests, the kind that happens when someone doesn't know how to react to something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. I felt my cheeks burn, but I told myself she was just surprised, maybe emotional about receiving something that had belonged to her grandmother. Then came the moment that shattered everything. Margaret Ashford, Benjamin's mother, and the undisputed queen of Millbrook society, leaned forward with interest. "What a sweet little piece," she said in her perfectly modulated voice. "Is it an antique?" "Not really," Sophia replied, still examining the necklace. "It's just something Mom picked up somewhere. She doesn't really have money for the expensive stuff. Mom's broke anyway, so this is probably a major purchase for her." The silence that followed was devastating. Not shocked silence, but the awkward quiet that happens when someone says something true but tactless. I watched 40 pairs of eyes either look away in embarrassment or fix on me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Benjamin cleared his throat and suggested they move on to the next gift. Sophia tucked the necklace back in its box without putting it on, and the party continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something that couldn't be taken back or smoothed over with social graces. I stayed for another hour, making small talk with people who now saw me differently than they had an hour before. I was no longer just Sophia's mother. I was the poor relation, the charity case, the reminder of what people like them could become if they weren't careful. The 40-minute drive back to Millbrook gave me plenty of time to think. The Toyota's heater wheezed as I navigated the winding coastal roads, and I found myself replaying Sophia's words over and over. Mom's broke anyway, said so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if my financial status was common knowledge, and my gift was nothing more than the desperate gesture of someone trying to buy love she couldn't afford. When I pulled into my driveway on Pine Street, the house looked exactly like what it was, the modest home of a retired hospital worker. The paint was fresh because I had done it myself last spring, and the garden was neat because I spent my evenings pulling weeds. But there was no disguising that this was a different world than the one Sophia now inhabited. I sat in my kitchen, still wearing my department store dress, and tried to understand when I'd become someone my own daughter was embarrassed by. Had it been gradual, or had there been a specific moment when I'd transformed from her mother into her burden? The house felt different that night, smaller somehow. I walked through rooms that Charles and I had painted together, past furniture we'd saved for months to buy, and I wondered if she remembered any of it. Did she remember the Christmas morning when she was 8 and we gave her a bicycle we'd put together ourselves because we couldn't afford the assembly fee? Did she remember the way we'd celebrated her high school graduation with a cake I'd made from scratch because bakery cakes were too expensive? Or had all of that been erased by marble countertops and designer handbags?
Benjamin Ashford met me at the door with his usual practiced smile. He was polite enough, but I could see him calculating the cost of my department store dress, probably wondering why his wife couldn't convince her mother to upgrade her wardrobe. "Eleanor," he said, "how wonderful that you could make it." The party was elegant in that effortless way that comes from hiring professionals and having more money than taste. Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres I couldn't pronounce. The living room, with its 14-foot ceilings and crystal chandeliers, was filled with people who spoke in the coded language of the privileged, discussing their little place in Bar Harbor or their children's acceptances to Ivy League schools. I found myself standing near the mahogany bar, nursing a single glass of wine and watching my daughter work the room. Sophia looked stunning in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She moved with confidence, air-kissing friends and laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny. For a moment, I felt proud of how far she'd come, even if the journey had taken her away from me. The gift opening happened in the library, a room lined with leather-bound books that looked like they'd never been opened. Sophia sat in a wing-back chair that probably belonged in a museum, surrounded by presents wrapped in paper that was too beautiful to tear. There were jewelry boxes from Tiffany, gift certificates to spas I'd never heard of, and a set of crystal wine glasses that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. When she got to my gift, a small wrapped box containing a simple gold necklace I'd saved for 3 months to buy, the room went quiet. Sophia opened it carefully, and I watched her face as she recognized what it was. The necklace had belonged to her grandmother, my mother, who'd passed it down to me with instructions to give it to my daughter when she was old enough to appreciate its value. Not monetary value, it was probably worth $200 at most, but the value of family history, of connection across generations. "Oh," Sophia said, holding it up to the light, "it's quaint." There was polite laughter from the assembled guests, the kind that happens when someone doesn't know how to react to something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. I felt my cheeks burn, but I told myself she was just surprised, maybe emotional, about receiving something that had belonged to her grandmother. Then came the moment that shattered everything. Margaret Ashford, Benjamin's mother and the undisputed queen of Millbrook society, leaned forward with interest. "What a sweet little piece," she said in her perfectly modulated voice. "Is it an antique?" "Not really," Sophia replied, still examining the necklace. "It's just something Mom picked up somewhere. She doesn't really have money for the expensive stuff." She looked up at the room with an apologetic smile. "Mom's broke anyway, so this is probably a major purchase for her." The silence that followed was devastating. Not shocked silence, but the awkward quiet that happens when someone says something true but tactless. I watched 40 pairs of eyes either look away in embarrassment or fix on me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Benjamin cleared his throat and suggested they move on to the next gift.
Sophia tucked the necklace back in its box without putting it on, and the party continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that couldn't be taken back or smoothed over with social graces. I stayed for another hour, making small talk with people who now saw me differently than they had an hour before. I was no longer just Sophia's mother. I was the poor relation, the charity case, the reminder of what people like them could become if they weren't careful. The 40-minute drive back to Millbrook gave me plenty of time to think. The Toyota's heater wheezed as I navigated the winding coastal roads, and I found myself replaying Sophia's words over and over. "Mom's broke anyway," said so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if my financial status was common knowledge, and my gift was nothing more than the desperate gesture of someone trying to buy love she couldn't afford. When I pulled into my driveway on Pine Street, the house looked exactly like what it was, the modest home of a retired hospital worker. The paint was fresh because I'd done it myself last spring, and the garden was neat because I spent my evenings pulling weeds, but there was no disguising that this was a different world from the one Sophia now inhabited. I sat in my kitchen, still wearing my department store dress, and tried to understand when I'd become someone my own daughter was embarrassed by. Had it been gradual? Or had there been a specific moment when I'd transformed from her mother into her burden? The house felt different that night, smaller somehow. I walked through rooms that Charles and I had painted together, past furniture we'd saved for months to buy, and I wondered if Sophia remembered any of it. Did she remember the Christmas morning when she was 8 and we gave her a bicycle we'd put together ourselves because we couldn't afford the assembly fee? Did she remember the way we had celebrated her high school graduation with a cake I'd made from scratch because bakery cakes were too expensive? Or had all of that been erased by marble countertops and designer handbags?
I was still sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning when the phone rang. For a moment, I thought it might be Sophia, calling to apologize or explain. Instead, it was my attorney, Victoria Sterling. "Eleanor," her voice was crisp despite the late hour, "I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to catch you before the morning. The Pemaquid Development Group made their final offer. Are you ready to hear the number?" Victoria Sterling had been handling my real estate investments for the past 10 years. Ever since my small portfolio had grown large enough to require professional management. She was one of only 3 people who knew the full scope of what I'd built, a real estate empire that now included over 300 acres of prime development land in Cumberland County. The Pemaquid Development Group had been courting me for 6 months. They were a consortium of Boston developers who'd identified coastal Maine as the next big opportunity for luxury residential and commercial development. What they needed was land, and what I had was exactly what they were looking for. "The final number is $42 million, Victoria said, for the entire portfolio. They want to close within 90 days. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the modest furniture and outdated appliances that had prompted my daughter's casual cruelty, and tried to process what Victoria had just told me. $42 million. More money than Sophia's in-laws had probably inherited across 3 generations. "There's one more thing," Victoria continued. "The trust documents. I'd established it 5 years ago, when my holdings had first reached significant value. Sophia was the primary beneficiary, with provisions for her children, if she had any. The idea had been to surprise her someday, to show her that her mother had been more capable than anyone had imagined. But sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, with the taste of humiliation still fresh in my mouth, I wasn't sure I wanted to give her that gift anymore. "The trust documents give you the right to modify the beneficiary at any time," Victoria reminded me. "You could establish a charitable foundation, create scholarships, or designate different heirs. It's entirely up to you." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I walked through my house, looking at photos that told the story of a family that no longer existed. There was Sophia at 5, missing her front teeth and grinning at the camera. Sophia at 16, wearing the dress I'd sewn for her junior prom because we couldn't afford to buy one. Sophia at 21, graduating from college with honors, tears in her eyes as she thanked Charles and I for working extra shifts to pay her tuition. When did that girl become the woman who could dismiss her mother's gift with such casual cruelty? I found myself in Charles's old study, a small room where he'd kept his accounting books for the years when he'd tried to run a small tax preparation service on the side. He'd never been particularly successful at it, but he'd been honest and careful, and I'd learned a lot about money management by watching him work. "What would you do?" I asked his photograph, the one from our wedding day when we were both young and poor and convinced that love could overcome anything. But Charles wasn't there to answer, and I was left alone with a decision that would change everything. The first light of dawn was creeping through the kitchen windows when I finally picked up the phone and called Victoria back. "I've made my decision about the sale," I told her. "Accept the higher offer, but I want to make some changes to the trust before we proceed." "What kind of changes?" I looked around my modest kitchen, at the coffee maker I'd bought at a yard sale and the table Charles and I had purchased when we were newlyweds. Then I thought about the library at the Ashford estate, about crystal wine glasses and charity galas, and about my daughter's voice saying, "Mom's broke anyway." I said, "I want to establish a foundation for scholarships, for kids whose parents work night shifts and clean up after other people's messes, kids who understand the value of $1 because they've watched their parents count each one." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "And Sophia?" I thought about the gold necklace, probably sitting forgotten in some drawer at the Ashford mansion. "I want to give her exactly what she thinks I'm worth. Nothing." Little did I know that my decision to rewrite the trust would set in motion a chain of events that would force Sophia to confront the truth about her mother and herself. Because when the news of my windfall became public, it wouldn't just change my life. It would reveal who my daughter really was, and whether the girl I'd raised was still somewhere inside the woman she'd become. The next morning came too soon, and not soon enough. I'd spent the remaining hours before dawn sitting in Charles's old recliner, watching the sun rise over Millbrook Harbor and thinking about the conversation I'd had with Victoria Sterling. $42 million. The number felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in newspaper stories, not to a 70-year-old woman who still clipped grocery coupons out of habit. By 7 a.m., I was dressed and ready to face whatever came next. I'd chosen my best outfit, a navy blue dress suit I'd bought for Charles's funeral 15 years ago, because something told me this was going to be a day that required armor. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling my modest kitchen with the familiar aroma that had started thousands of mornings in this house. My first call was to Victoria's office. Even at that early hour, she was already at her desk, probably reviewing contracts and preparing for what she knew would be a complicated day. "Eleanor," she said, her voice crisp and professional, "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. Are you absolutely certain about the trust modifications? Once we file the paperwork, it becomes very difficult to reverse." I looked around my kitchen, at the mismatched chairs and the refrigerator covered with outdated grocery store circulars. Then I thought about Sophia's voice saying, "Mom's broke anyway," to a room full of people who would remember those words forever. "I'm certain," I said. "Draw up the papers for the Eleanor Blackwood Foundation for Educational Excellence. The entire trust transfers to the foundation, minus a small bequest for Sophia." How small? I thought about the gold necklace she dismissed so casually, about the years of working double shifts to pay for her college education, and about the pride in her voice when she'd introduced me to her new friends as just my mother. $5,000, I said, with a note explaining that it's exactly what she thinks I'm worth. Victoria was quiet for a moment.
Eleanor, I have to ask, are you sure this isn't a decision you're making out of anger? Family estrangements can be healed, but financial decisions like this are permanent. I appreciated her concern, but this wasn't about anger. It was about truth. Victoria, my daughter looked at 40 people last night and told them I was broke. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She genuinely believes that's all I am. Maybe it's time she learned the difference between being poor and choosing to live simply. At 10 a.m., I drove to Portland for my meeting with the Pemaquid Development Group. Their offices occupied the top floor of a gleaming tower downtown, with views of Casco Bay that probably cost more per month than I made in a year as a custodian. The receptionist, a polished young woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, seemed surprised when I announced myself. "Mrs. Blackwood," she repeated, consulting her computer screen as if there might be some mistake. "You're here for the 10 o'clock with Mr. Richardson?" I understood her confusion. In my navy blue suit and sensible shoes, carrying a vinyl purse I'd bought at Walmart, I didn't look like someone who controlled $42 million worth of prime Maine real estate. But that was exactly the point. I'd spent 15 years being invisible, and that invisibility had been my greatest asset. James Richardson, the development group's senior partner, was a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted. He greeted me in his corner office with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed surprise. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, gesturing to a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment had been. "I have to admit, you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" I asked, settling into the chair and noting the way he tried not to stare at my off-the-rack clothing. He said, "I assumed we were dealing with an investment group or a family trust. We never imagined a single individual had been quietly assembling this portfolio." He spread a map across his mahogany desk, marked with red circles indicating each of my properties. Seeing them all laid out like that, I was struck by how strategic my purchases had been. Even working on instinct and overheard conversations, I'd managed to acquire land that formed a nearly perfect corridor for development. "Your timing was remarkable," Richardson continued. "You bought most of these parcels years before anyone else recognized their potential. How did you know?" I thought about all those late nights mopping floors at Riverside General, about conversations I'd overheard between administrators and county officials, and about the patient way I'd mapped out growth patterns and infrastructure plans. "I listened," I said simply. "People talk freely around cleaning staff. They assume we're not paying attention." Richardson laughed, but it wasn't condescending. "Well, your listening skills are worth $42 million. When can we close?" "There's one condition," I said. "I want you to know that the Ashford Construction Company has made a competing offer, $38 million. Richardson's expression sharpened. "The Ashfords, they're local, aren't they? That explains their eagerness. They probably think they can lowball you because you're a local seller." "Something like that. But I'm accepting your offer. I just wanted you to know about the competition."
We spent the next 2 hours going over contracts and timelines. Richardson's legal team worked with Victoria via conference call to iron out details, and by noon we had a preliminary agreement. The official closing would take place in 30 days, but the contracts were binding. As I prepared to leave, Richardson walked me to the elevator. "Mrs. Blackwood, can I ask what you plan to do with the money? Investment like this, at your age? Are you planning to enjoy your retirement?" I thought about the foundation Victoria was establishing, about scholarships for kids whose parents worked night shifts and cleaned up after other people. "I'm planning to invest in the future," I said, "just like I always have." News travels fast in small towns, especially news involving $42 million. By the time I returned to Millbrook that afternoon, Victoria had already begun the process of transferring the properties and filing the foundation paperwork. More importantly, word of the sale had somehow reached the local newspaper. The Millbrook Gazette wasn't much of a paper, mostly church socials and high school sports scores, but they'd never had a story like this. When I pulled into my driveway, there was a young reporter waiting on my front porch, notebook in hand and excitement in his eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Tommy Chen from the Gazette. Is it true that you just sold property worth over $40 million?
I looked at this earnest young man, probably fresh out of college and hungry for his first big story, and realized that my quiet life was about to become very public. "I have no comment," I said, but I said it kindly. "But, Mrs. Blackwood, this is the biggest real estate deal in Cumberland County history. People are saying you've been secretly buying land for years. How did a hospital custodian afford—" "Tommy," I interrupted, recognizing his last name from the hospital directory. "Isn't your mother Linda Chen from the billing department?" He nodded, suddenly looking younger. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you know what it's like to watch your parents work hard for every dollar. And you know that sometimes the people who look like they have the least are the ones who've been planning for the future." I left him on the porch and went inside. But I knew the story would be in tomorrow's paper regardless of my comments. In a town of 8,000 people, a $42 million real estate deal involving the local custodian would be front-page news for weeks. The phone started ringing at 4 p.m. First, it was my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door for 20 years and wanted to know if the rumors were true. Then it was my former supervisor at the hospital, calling to congratulate me and ask if I'd considered donating to their new equipment fund. By evening, I'd received calls from financial planners, investment advisors, and 3 different churches, all suddenly very interested in my spiritual welfare. But the call I was waiting for never came. The next morning's Gazette featured a front-page story with the headline, "Local Woman's Land Deal Nets $42 million." Tommy Chen had done his homework, tracking down property records and interviewing county officials who confirmed the scope of my land acquisitions. The article painted me as a shrewd investor who'd quietly outmaneuvered much larger players in the real estate market. Interestingly enough, the article mentioned the competing bid from Ashford Construction, noting that the company had been aggressively pursuing the same properties for their upcoming luxury development project. I was reading the article over my morning coffee when the phone rang. This time, it was Benjamin Ashford. "Eleanor." His voice was different from the polished politeness I was used to. There was an edge to it, a sharpness that suggested he was finally taking me seriously. "I saw the article in the paper. I think we need to talk." "About what, Benjamin?" "About the deal you just made, and about the fact that you sold to outsiders instead of keeping the development local." I almost laughed. 3 days ago, I was the poor relation at his dinner table. Now I was someone whose business decisions warranted his attention. I sold to the highest bidder. Isn't that how capitalism works? You could have negotiated with us. We would have matched their offer. You offered $38 million. They offered 42. That's not a negotiation, Benjamin. That's basic arithmetic. There was a pause, and I could hear him calculating, probably wondering how the cleaning lady had outmaneuvered their family's construction empire. "Eleanor, there are things you don't understand about local development. The Pemaquad Group is from Boston. They don't have ties to the community. They'll build whatever makes them the most money regardless of the impact on Millbrook. And your family would build something more appropriate. We've been part of this community for 4 generations. We understand what belongs here." I thought about the Ashford estate, about crystal wine glasses and charity galas, about my daughter learning to be embarrassed by her own mother. "Benjamin, what belongs here is what the market will support, just like what belongs at your dinner table is what you're willing to tolerate." "What's that supposed to mean?"
"It means I'm learning that value is subjective," I said. "Some people think I'm worth $42 million. Others think I'm worth nothing. The difference is in who's doing the evaluating." I hung up before he could respond, but I knew the conversation was far from over. The Ashfords hadn't built their empire by accepting defeat gracefully, and I just cost them a $4 million opportunity. 5 days passed without a word from Sophia. The story had been picked up by the Portland Press-Herald and the Bangor Daily News. Television reporters from Augusta had driven down to film segments about the millionaire custodian of Millbrook. My phone rang constantly, but none of the calls were from my daughter. I understood her silence in a way. How do you call your mother to congratulate her on being worth $42 million when you'd publicly declared her broke just a week earlier? How do you admit that you'd fundamentally misunderstood the person who'd raised you, fed you, and worked extra shifts to pay for your education? But understanding didn't make the silence hurt less. On Thursday afternoon, Victoria called with an update on the foundation paperwork. "Everything's filed and approved," she said. "The Eleanor Blackwood Foundation for Educational Excellence is officially established. The first scholarships can be awarded as early as next fall." "Good," I said. "I want to start with kids from working families, parents who clean offices, work in factories, or take care of other people's children, kids who understand that money doesn't grow on trees." "There's something else," Victoria continued. "I've prepared the bequest documentation for Sophia. $5,000, as requested, along with the letter explaining your decision. Would you like me to deliver it personally, or should I send it through the mail?" I thought about that question for a long time. A personal delivery would force a confrontation, a conversation that might heal our relationship or destroy it completely. Mail would be safer, more clinical, but it would also be cowardly. "Personal delivery," I said, "but I want to be there when you do it." "Are you sure that's wise?" "Probably not," I admitted, "but it's honest." We arranged to meet at the Ashford estate on Saturday afternoon. Victoria drove up from Portland in her BMW, dressed in the kind of expensive suit that commanded respect in boardrooms and courthouses. I rode with her, wearing the same navy dress I'd worn to the Pemaquid meeting because I'd learned that clothes don't make the woman, character does. Benjamin answered the door, his face tight with barely controlled anger. He'd clearly been expecting this visit, probably dreading it since the newspaper article had made it clear that his mother-in-law was not the pathetic figure he'd assumed her to be. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Victoria, please, come in." The house looked exactly the same as it had a week ago, but my perspective had changed completely. The marble foyer and crystal chandeliers no longer intimidated me. They were just expensive decorations in a house that owed its existence to the same kind of careful financial planning I'd been doing for 15 years. Victoria was waiting in the living room, perched on the edge of a silk-upholstered sofa as if she might bolt at any moment. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the knowledge that her poor mother had just completed the largest real estate deal in county history. "Mom," she said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Uncertainty. "Sophia." I settled into the chair across from her, noting the way she avoided my eyes. "I imagine you've seen the papers?" Yes. I had no idea about any of it." Victoria opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "I'm here in my capacity as Mrs. Blackwood's attorney to deliver some documents regarding her estate planning." She handed Sophia an envelope. "This is a bequest from your mother's trust, along with a letter explaining the distribution of her assets." Sophia's hands shook slightly as she opened the envelope. I watched her face as she read the amount, $5,000, and then continued to the letter I'd dictated to Victoria the night before. "Dear Sophia," she read aloud, her voice getting smaller with each word. "You recently told a roomful of people that I was broke. Since you clearly believe that assessment, I've decided to leave you exactly what you think I'm worth, a token amount that reflects your evaluation of my life's work. The remainder of my estate will establish a foundation providing scholarships to children whose parents worked night shifts, clean up after others, and sacrifice daily for their families' futures. These children understand the value of money because they've watched their parents count every dollar. Perhaps they'll grow up to be more grateful than some people I've raised. The foundation will ensure that hard work and invisible sacrifice are rewarded, even when they're not appreciated." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Sophia's face cycle through emotions, shock, shame, anger, and something that might have been grief. Benjamin stood behind her chair, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "Eleanor, don't you think this is a bit extreme? Sophia made one thoughtless comment that revealed 15 years of thoughtless assumptions. Benjamin, your family offered $38 million for my land.
Did you think I was too stupid to recognize its value? Did you assume I'd accept less than it was worth because I'm just the cleaning lady? That's not. It's exactly what you thought. Just like Sophia thought I was too poor to afford a decent birthday gift. Neither of you ever wondered how a hospital custodian managed to raise a daughter who graduated from college debt-free. You never asked how I maintained a house, kept a car running, and still had money left over to help with her wedding expenses. Sophia finally looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said, and you said it because it's what you truly believe about me." "But I love you," she whispered. "I know you do, and I meant it. But you don't respect me. And I've spent too many years pretending that love without respect is enough." The conversation that followed was the most honest one Sophia and I had had in years. With Benjamin hovering awkwardly nearby, she tried to explain her behavior, to justify her assumptions about my financial situation. "You always lived so simply," she said, wiping her eyes with a tissue that probably cost more than my lunch. "You never bought anything expensive, never traveled, never seemed to want more than what you had. You thought simple meant poor. You thought that because I chose to live modestly, I must be incapable of living any other way. Didn't you want things? Nice things?" I looked around the Ashford living room at the antiques and artwork that screamed wealth and tried to help her understand. "Sophia, I wanted security. I wanted to know that if anything happened to me, you'd be taken care of. I wanted to build something that would last, something that mattered. Every dollar I didn't spend on luxuries was a dollar I could invest in the future. But you never told me. You let me think." "I let you think what you chose to think. I never lied about my finances, Sophia. I just didn't feel the need to prove my worth by displaying it." Benjamin finally spoke up, his voice tight with frustration. "This is all very touching, but what about the development deal? You've given millions of dollars to strangers instead of keeping it in the family." I turned to look at him, this man who'd married my daughter and slowly taught her to be ashamed of where she came from. "Benjamin, your family didn't want to pay fair market value for my land. You assumed I'd accept less because you thought I didn't know any better. Just like you assumed I'd be grateful for invitations to your parties where my daughter could publicly dismiss me as a charity case. You never what? Valued my opinion? Asked about my life? Wondered how a custodian managed to raise a daughter who graduated summa cum laude? You created a perfect little world where I was the poor relation, and you never questioned it because it made you feel superior." Sophia stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the harbor. "So this is it? You're cutting me out of your life because I made one stupid comment?" "I'm not cutting you out of my life. I'm cutting you out of my will. There's a difference." "Is there?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with 15 years of growing distance and mutual misunderstanding. I stood up, smoothing my navy dress, and walked over to stand beside her at the window. "Sophia, do you remember when you were 12 and wanted to take piano lessons?" She nodded, confused by the change of subject. "Your father and I couldn't afford a piano, so I convinced Mrs. Patterson next door to let you practice on hers for an hour every day after school. You practiced for 3 years, got quite good actually, but when you turned 15, you quit. Do you remember why?" Because Sarah Matthews had a grand piano, and I was embarrassed to tell people I had to practice on a neighbor's old upright." "Exactly. You were so focused on what you didn't have that you stopped appreciating what you did have. And somewhere along the way, you started looking at me the same way you looked at Mrs. Patterson's piano, as something that worked but wasn't quite good enough to be proud of." Victoria cleared her throat delicately. "If I may," she said, "there are still some legal matters to address. Eleanor, the foundation documents are finalized, but you have the right to modify the personal bequest if you choose. The $5,000 isn't set in stone."
I could see hope flicker in Sophia's eyes, and it broke my heart. Not because I didn't love her, but because even now she was focused on the money rather than the lesson. "The bequest stands," I said firmly, "but there's something else." I turned to face both Sophia and Benjamin, these two people who'd built their lives around the assumption that worth could be measured in material possessions. The Eleanor Blackwood Foundation will award its first scholarships next fall, $25,000 each to 10 students whose parents work in service industries, cleaning, food service, home health care, child care, people who make other people's lives better but don't get recognized for it. I paused, watching their faces. I'm also establishing an internship program. Every summer, the foundation will sponsor college students to work with local businesses, learning about real estate, finance, and investment. It's amazing what you can learn if you pay attention to the right conversations. Mom, I know I hurt you. I know I've been ungrateful. Can you ever forgive me?
"I forgave you the moment you said it," I told her honestly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean there aren't consequences. You're my daughter, and I love you more than life itself. But respect isn't inherited, Sophia. It's earned." Benjamin spoke up one last time. "What about family loyalty? What about keeping wealth in the community?" "Benjamin, I am keeping wealth in the community. I'm investing in children who remember where they came from. Kids who will grow up knowing that success doesn't give you the right to look down on the people who helped you achieve it." I gathered my purse and turned to Victoria. "I think we're finished here." As we reached the door, Sophia called out one last time. "Mom, the necklace you gave me. Grandma's necklace? I put it on this morning. I haven't taken it off since I read your letter." I turned back to look at her. This beautiful woman who'd somehow forgotten that love and pride could coexist with simplicity and sacrifice. She was touching the small gold chain at her throat, the one that had belonged to my mother and her mother before that. "It looks lovely on you," I said, and I meant it. The Eleanor Blackwood Foundation awarded its first scholarships in September, just as the leaves were beginning to turn. 10 students, children of nurses' aides, janitors, factory workers, and home healthcare providers, received $25,000 each to pursue their education. The local newspaper covered the ceremony, held at the Millbrook Community Center rather than any fancy venue. I wanted the families to feel comfortable, to know that this was their moment to shine. Watching those kids accept their awards, seeing the pride and relief in their parents' faces, was worth more than $42 million. Sophia came to the ceremony. She sat in the back, wearing her grandmother's necklace and a simple dress I'd never seen before. We didn't speak during the event, but afterward, as families were taking pictures and sharing stories, she approached me. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, about respect. And I want to apply for the internship program, for next summer." I studied her face, looking for signs of calculation or manipulation, but I saw only sincerity. "Sophia, you're 38 years old, with an MBA. Why would you want an internship?" "Because I want to understand," she said simply. "I want to learn what you learned, see what you saw. I want to understand how someone can clean floors at night and build an empire during the day." I thought about Charles's old recliner, about all those nights I'd sat there planning and dreaming and working toward a future I could barely imagine. I thought about the invisible woman who'd listened to conversations and recognized opportunities that others missed. "The internship is unpaid," I warned her. "I know. And it starts at 6 a.m. with coffee service for business meetings. You'd be invisible again, just like your mother was." "I know," she repeated. "I think it's time I learned what invisible looks like from the inside." 6 months later, Sophia started her internship with the foundation. She learned to serve coffee to city council members and listen to their conversations about zoning and development.
She studied property records and attended planning meetings, slowly beginning to understand the patience and strategy that had built my empire. More importantly, she learned to see the people she'd once overlooked: the cleaning staff at City Hall, the maintenance workers at the community center, the single mothers who worked 2 jobs to pay for their children's education. The foundation has grown beyond my wildest dreams. We now provide scholarships in 3 counties, and our internship program has expanded to include mentorship from local business leaders who understand the value of hard work and quiet determination. As for my relationship with Sophia, it's different now. Better, I think. Though not without its complications. She still lives in the big house with Benjamin, still moves in circles where people measure worth by wallet size. But she also volunteers at the foundation every Saturday, helping scholarship recipients navigate college applications and financial aid forms. And sometimes, when she thinks no one is looking, I catch her watching the cleaning staff at events, seeing them as people rather than furniture for the first time in her life. The last entry in this story isn't about money or property or even family reconciliation. It's about a simple truth that took me 70 years to fully understand. The most valuable things we build aren't the ones we can see. They're the ones we pass on, the lessons, the values, the understanding that true worth isn't measured in dollars, but in dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up for what we believe in. My daughter learned that lesson the hard way, but she learned it. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth more than $42 million.